Tick-tock, time to rock. Good evening and good morning and good afternoon to all the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims and the atheists and the agnostics and the Hindus and the Buddhists and yes, even the Baha'is who are watching us right now. We love you, Rainn Wilson. I am your friendly neighborhood philosopher, David Wood, and I'm here with my friend Anthony Rogers. We are going to continue our discussion of Allah's physical, literal body parts. And we have some very good reason for doing this. Anthony, remind everyone. Now, we understand that lots of people have already been watching, so they'll understand why this is important. But for people who haven't been watching all of this and may have missed some things, or for people who are here for the first time, why don't you tell them why it's important, absolutely crucial, for Christians and Muslims to learn what the Quran and the Hadiths actually say about Allah's physical parts?
Right. Well, first of all, Muslims often make the objection against the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation that this is an impossibility because God is transcendent and isn't to be identified in any way as like a human being. However, in the Islamic sources, we find that's exactly how Allah is described, and those descriptions can't be merely tossed aside as simply figures of speech or tropes or what have you. In fact, Muhammad and his earliest companions and quite a significant number of Muslims throughout history have taken those things exactly as they appear in the Quran. And so the criticism leveled against Christianity is actually more appropriately leveled at Islam. And what's even more problematic is that Islam doesn't have a concept of the incarnation. And so when it describes Allah in these ways, it ends up saying that this is inherent to the very nature of its deity. Right? This is in stark contrast to Christianity, where God is ultimately conceived of as an infinite, eternal, unchangeable spirit. And the incarnation then became necessary in order for Christ to lay down his life as a sacrifice for sinners. So the humanity of Christ is something that he assumed. It's not part of his eternal divinity. But in Islam, you actually have a deity who is like that then from all eternity. And this is also philosophically problematic because then you have a deity who's essentially a being that necessarily must have there must be certain things that are already true in order for him to exist. In other words, you have to have things like space and time and so forth, or else an embodied being is an impossibility. Right? This isn't an impossibility for the God of the Bible because he transcends spatial and temporal limitations. But if Allah is essentially a spatio-temporal being, then he couldn't be the originator of heaven and earth. He would need those things already in order for himself to exist.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is actually very important in the world of Christian-Muslim conversations, Christian-Muslim dialogues, because Muslims are usually going on the offensive on this issue. Wait a minute, you believe that Jesus Christ is a physical being, and yet you believe he's God. This is absurd. This is ridiculous. This is nonsense. When we have a way of explaining that, we believe in the incarnation. We don't believe that God, as he exists in himself, is a physical being. But most Christians, and as we've seen, most Muslims don't know what the Quran teaches about Allah's physical nature. And so if they did, that conversation would be going in a different way, right? Does everyone understand how most arguments that Muslims use against Christianity or for their own position, those arguments usually only work in an atmosphere of ignorance. If people don't know what's going on, if people don't know what Islam actually teaches. And so if we change that, if we change it to people actually knowing what the Quran and the Hadith say on these issues, and that people actually know what Muslim scholars themselves say about these issues, well, it completely changes the conversation, and Muslims don't have that advantage of sharing a bad argument in a in an atmosphere of ignorance. Take away the ignorance, the argument fails and then flips back on Islam. So that's why we are spending so many live streams covering this issue. Generally, if we spend 5, 6, 7 live streams covering a topic, it's because the topic is important and usually because it hasn't been covered enough in the past. So we're going to go through that. Everyone who's watching right now, if you could hit the like button, that helps the YouTube algorithm decide how it should be shared with other viewers if they're interested in topics like these. And be sure, if you get a chance, take the link, send it out to your friends on Twitter and Facebook so that they can jump into this discussion. Wanted to start with a couple comments here. Top student says, David, please include a cat walking on the Quran at the end of every video. P.S. Everyone likes cats on YouTube and no one likes Sharia. Perfect combo. Top student here is referring to a video I made, which was a response to a Muslim video, and you can watch these. There were, and I only did this, just so you know, it never crosses my mind to say, hey, I'm going to make a video of a cat walking on the Quran. I only did that because a Muslim went through tons of my videos and started posting videos, Muslim videos, claiming that a cat will not walk on the Quran. Then there were all these reaction videos by non-Muslims who were shocked that a cat will not walk on the Quran. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. These, you can watch them. You can watch the reaction videos. Several were by Catholics who were shocked that a cat would not walk on the Quran. They were very impressed by this. Since Muslims were putting this forward as some sort of scientific test that would confirm the Quran, it only makes sense that we're going to repeat the test, right? So I put a Quran on the floor, offered the cat some food, which is what was being done in the videos. They were offering the cat food. Would you walk on the Quran for food? And the cats wouldn't walk on the Quran for food. It took me 1 to 2 seconds, multiple times, to get a cat to walk on the Quran. And so top student here is is encouraging me to add those kinds of videos to the end. I don't think I'll do that, but I might have to revisit the cat on the Quran issue. One of those just got banned by the country of Pakistan. The country of Pakistan banned one of my cat walking on the Quran videos. Now just think about the situation, right? They're not banning the videos claiming that a cat won't walk on the Quran. So the atmosphere that they want in Pakistan is they want Muslims and non-Muslims to be able to see videos where a cat won't walk on the Quran. And they want this to be claimed as proof that Islam is true. That's what they want. But they don't want the refutation. They don't want someone sitting down and saying, this is actually a total lie and I can refute it in 2 seconds. They don't want that. So they are deliberately encouraging an atmosphere of deception where the Muslim population is deceived into thinking that a cat will not walk on the Quran. And they do this by allowing fake videos of cats not walking on the Quran and then blocking videos that refute these videos. And I mean, this is a nation. This is a nation that is doing this. So very disturbing stuff going on there. Wanted to thank, Tatiana, thanks. She included a gift for our 5 boys. Well, I will definitely get that to them. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we've been saying before that we've been going through the Muslim sources, right? We've been going through the Muslim sources. We've been looking at quotations from the Quran, from the Hadith, giving arguments on why even Muslim scholars interpret these things literally to mean that Allah has literal parts. It's not just us saying it. So Anthony gave a number of arguments showing why, for many of these passages, the only way to really interpret, to understand them, the only way they make sense is if they are interpreted literally to mean that Allah has literal body parts. And we've mentioned over and over again that there are Muslim scholars down through the centuries who've agreed with that. Anthony went through a bunch of quotations last time. If you missed that, you can go back and watch it. And I gave a quotation from an Islamic site called Islam Q&A where scholars address issues. And they pointed out that all the scholars agreed on this, right? All the scholars. Now, this doesn't mean all Muslim scholars, but it's all Muslim scholars that they regard as orthodox. So this is a very important issue, and there's a wide array of support for this. Why did we even bring this up in the first place? Well, if you remember, Mohammed Hijab was talking to the Muslim audience, and I brought up the fact that Allah has parts, which, I mean, I took for granted that Muslims understand this because their scholars are saying it, because it's in their sources. Mohammed Hijab laughed it off. He seemed to not think that any Muslim scholars hold this position. And then he actually got the Muslim audience to laugh at the position that Allah has actual body parts. But guess what? If that's orthodoxy, if that's Islamic orthodoxy, as we've been showing, then Mohammed Hijab just got Muslims to laugh at the orthodox Muslim position, in which case he converted them into heretics with that, right? Because before, I could tell they didn't know what to believe about this. They're just, what? Is that true? We got to wait and listen to our guy. Well, their guy got them to laugh at the idea that Allah has physical body parts or literal body parts. So very interesting what Muslim apologists are doing, converting the Muslim community into heretics. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some video clips, because we said we're going to do this. We might actually have to do two, where we're going through the clips, because I have a lot of videos from Muslim scholars acknowledging that Allah has literal body parts. And they all say exactly what we've been saying all along. They say that Allah has these parts. Because of the descriptions of these parts, we have to take them literally, but don't think that you understand what they look like very well, because there's nothing like Allah. And Anthony's going to be addressing that point. But let's go ahead and start off with some clips from various Muslim scholars, and we'll see how things go from there. So let's go ahead and pull up the first clip here. This is from Sheikh Asim al-Hakim.
So Allah described in the Quran that he has a face. Allah described in the Quran that he has two hands when he addressed Iblis, Satan. And he told him, what prevented you from prostrating to what I have created with my two hands?
So he's going to, I basically took several clips of when he's talking about Allah's various parts, and then he's going to give the interpretation. But Anthony, is he correct there that the Quran refers to Allah having two hands?
Yeah, he mentioned both face and hands. And just off the top of my head, I think there's something like 10 statements in the Quran making reference to Allah's face, not to mention the numerous references in the Hadith. And again, when you look at these statements, both in the Quran and in the Hadith together, it becomes very clear that this is not simply a metaphor or a figure of speech. It's literally to be understood as a face. The Quran also makes copious reference to Allah's hands. What's interesting about that clip, and you can testify to this, although I've watched Sheikh Asim numerous times, this clip is one that you picked independently of anything I've said, and yet my primary example from the Quran for the fact that Allah has hands was the very reference he gave. Right? In Surah 38:75, it makes reference, not only, it doesn't just simply use the word hand, but hands in the plural, and in particular it uses a form that means literally two hands. Mm-hmm. And Muslim scholars make much of that fact. You know, they point out that if it was not to be understood literally, then it's hard to understand why there would be this emphasis on the specific number of hands that he used in the creation of Adam. But furthermore, there's the fact that Satan was required to prostrate to Adam precisely because he was made with Allah's hands, which means there's something special about Adam, namely that he was made with Allah's hands. And that's the reason why Satan should have bowed down to him. And of course, when you look in the Hadith, you find out that this was in fact to be understood literally, because Muhammad said that people on the day of resurrection are going to seek out Adam to intercede for them. They're going to think that he's worthy enough to intercede between them and Allah, because he was he was special by virtue of being created with Allah's two hands. And that's just one among a number of references in the Hadith that show it. This has to be taken literally. And as you're pointing out now, is from the clip from Sheikh Hassan, this is exactly how Muslims have understood this.
Yeah. So when you're claiming this, when you're making this claim, hey, these have to be literal hands. You're not a Christian imposing this view on Islamic sources. You're simply giving the exact same conclusion that Muslims down through history have come to.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've told you, and we said it on one of the earlier videos. When I went to the Quran, I went to it with the assumption that it was going to teach something about at least the nature and attributes of God that corresponded to the same concept that you would find in Judaism and Christianity, especially since you hear Muslims all the time saying, we have the same God, we just disagree with the Trinity, or we believe the same thing that the Jews believe, we just reject certain distinctives of Christianity. Well, then that sort of creates the assumption that what we're going to find when we look at the attributes of Allah is that He's unlimited, He's incorporeal, He's immutable, things of that nature. And so that was my disposition when I went to the Islamic sources. But as I kept reading them, it became patently obvious that Muhammad understood these things the way a pagan would have understood them. And he understood them quite literally. And he communicated that very clearly to his companions. And that's what they passed on to the successive generations of Muslims. And so then when I was seeing this sort of thing, I'm thinking, I've got to be doing something wrong here, because I just can't avoid understanding these things as literal, even though I want to take them differently. Mm-hmm. And I was gratified when I found out that this is exactly what Muslim scholars have been saying. Mm-hmm. So it was actually an after-the-fact thing that I discovered Muslim scholars were saying the same thing. I discovered it in the Quran and the Hadith, and later discovered that Muslims were saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a good time to bring up this little objection we have on the side. This is from Aladdin, and I interacted with him a week ago, or might have been a week ago, or might have been 2 weeks ago. Had an interaction with him when Vocab and I were up in the middle of the night, and we were taking discussions. And so Aladdin here says, David, you as a Christian believe your God Jesus is human, and you can't refute it. And you impose this idea on Islam, and we know it's not true. Now, we just played a clip. We're about to play a bunch of clips from Muslim scholars saying, "Oh, it's true. Oh, it's true. Allah has physical, literal body parts. We don't know what they look like. We can't understand how they are, but we understand that Allah has them." And here he is. Nope. All these Muslim scholars are wrong. He's saying they're all wrong. Why would these Muslims that we're about to play tons of video clips from all be lying? So Anthony, you've already addressed this, and just so you know, Aladdin, if you want to talk about the deity of Christ and the incarnation, Sam Shamoun and I are having a full live stream on Sunday on this, because Christmas is coming up when people are thinking about the incarnation. We're going to have a live stream on this where Christians and Muslims can bring forth their questions. So if you want to focus on that, we're gonna be spending the entire live stream. Right now, we're talking about your God, what your God is like, and we're showing evidence of what your God is like. And you keep saying that these things aren't true. But Anthony, go ahead and give them an idea of what the problem with this is. I think you've already addressed it. You've already addressed it multiple times as we've gone through this series. But just repeat, since he may have come on late. So the objection again is, as a Christian, you believe your God, Jesus, is human, and you can't refute it. You can't. Well, one, we wouldn't want to refute the claim that Jesus is human, right? We believe that, right? And you impose this idea on Islam, and we know it's not true.
Yeah. So, well, first thing is, when he says you believe your God, Jesus, is human, it needs to be reiterated. Mm-hmm. We already said this. Needs to be reiterated. When we say that Jesus is human, we're not saying that his divinity is his humanity. Jesus is both God and man. He has two distinct natures. His divine nature is his eternal, essential nature, that which has been true of him from all eternity. His human nature is something that was assumed at a point in time, namely the incarnation, which we're going to celebrate in a couple of days here. His human nature is something that was assumed in time and is not to be confused with his divine nature. The problem that Muslims have is that Allah's nature, as described in the Quran, which consists of having body and body parts, is not something that was assumed at a point in time. This is a description of Allah's nature as such. Allah doesn't have two natures, right? If you want to say that he does, then you lose much of the momentum of your argument against Christianity, right? Namely that this sort of thing is incoherent or otherwise problematic and objectionable. Now, the other thing that's interesting is when he says that we're imposing this idea on Islam. Now, we're not doing that, but what's interesting is we could at least understand why we might have a motivation for that, right? If we were the sorts of people that he's insinuating we are, right? We're not honest enough, don't have the integrity or sincerity to accurately represent Islam. We could see why that might be a motivation in our case. But how does he account for people like Sheikh Asim here and the numerous other Muslims we could quote and other Muslims we will quote in a moment? You know, how does he account for them? Do they have this bias to undermine Islam by saying that Allah has these parts? No, he can't do that. And so it's simply not true. We've shown over and over again, this is what Muhammad taught. This is what his companions believed. This is what the early Muslims like Ahmed bin Hanbal, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Taymiyyah after them. This is what Muslims have been saying for centuries, and it's only a result of the intrusion of an alien philosophy, Greek philosophy, that got Muslims to start thinking along different lines, in some cases, not all Muslims. So.
All right, one more follow-up from Aladdin. And guys, notice, we are happy to interact with the Muslims here, but notice how they just will not really deal with the topic in any way that deals with the texts seriously or deals with what their scholars are saying. So Aladdin says, David Wu, you really can't forget Mohammed Hijab. Do you this prove he damaged your arguments and you can't take it? Please relax. Get new life career ending. Okay. Now, notice the problem here, and we might need to go back and play the clip of Hijab. I said Allah. This was one of the points I was making, that Allah has literal body parts, and it's Muslim scholars. Even Muslim scholars acknowledge that Allah has literal body parts. That is, why did I say that? Because that's Orthodox Islam. That is Orthodox Islam according to the Quran, according to the Hadith, according to the Sirah, according to the Tafsir, according to Muslim scholars down through the centuries, and including according to a bunch of Muslim scholars that we're going to show you in these live streams. Mohammed Hijab got up, rejected the claim, and laughed at it. So he laughed at the claim that Allah has literal body parts. What does this mean? There are only two interpretations here, right? Either he didn't know, so he's ignorant, in which case, because he's ignorant and denied it, laughed it off, he still convinced the Muslim audience that this is a laughable doctrine, that only a fool would believe this sort of thing about Allah. So he deceived the audience, but through ignorance. He didn't intentionally deceive them, but he ended up deceiving them anyway. That's one possibility. Or two, he does know that Muslim scholars affirm the literal parts of Allah, and he deceived the audience. He deceived the audience because he wanted to score some cheap debate points by doing away with that argument. So it's one of those two things. Now, as a Muslim, if you really care what Muhammad and Allah say about Allah's parts, you should want to get to the truth about this. But we just find out that you don't. And that's really a disturbing situation, right? Where you have a Muslim audience and the Muslim speaker can say something that's completely false about Islam. I would think that Muslims would want to correct him, would want their speaker to be corrected if he is saying something that is false according to Orthodox Islamic theology. But I find that they don't, and you're a perfect example of this, right? We are showing you from your sources, from your scholars, that Allah has body parts. You're denying it and trying to change the subject and affirming Mohammed Hijab's position when, according to your own scholars, Mohammed Hijab is basically a Mutazilite if he's denying this, right? And so you really don't care what Islam actually teaches. How do you call yourself a Muslim? Islam means submission. A Muslim is one who submits. Allah has revealed to you through his prophet Muhammad what he is like. You laugh at what he says he's like. You make fun of it. You deny it. You say it's not true. And that's what you do in the comment section anytime we bring up what your God is actually like. Do you believe this, Anthony?
Yeah, there's another comment that he made there where he says he's now changing the terms of the argument. He says, David, I challenge you to show where Allah has human parts. Okay,
well, no. Anthony, have we ever said he has human parts?
All we're pointing out is that he has parts. The same terms that are used to describe human parts are used for Allah. That doesn't mean that they're an exact equivalent, right? I mean, we also use the term face and hands for other creatures. We don't, when I say that David has a face, it doesn't mean I'm saying that he has the face of an animal, right?
Or a clock.
He has an animal face. Any more than when I speak of an animal having a face, I'm saying it has a human face, right? No, we recognize that these terms don't mean the exact same thing. In fact, we're going to hear Sheikh Asim very shortly making this very point. And so I won't go on with that further. He'll make the point for me, but it's simply a straw man to pretend that that's what we were arguing. It's not.
Yeah, so, and guys, notice, when we bring up arguments, what do many Muslim apologists, not all, but what do many Muslim apologists do? They misrepresent what we said and then attack that. You saw this multiple times in the debate with hijab, right? So they do that. And notice, what does Al-Din do right here? What do their followers do? They do the exact same thing. Oh, you're saying Allah has human body part. Show us where we said that.
That's actually a good explanation or answer to his question about why we are still addressing hijab. The same errors that we saw in Mohammed Hijab are being instantiated or perpetuated in people like Al-Din. It's just an unending thing. So we're going to continue to speak to these issues as long as Muslims continue to make those errors.
Matter of fact, and we might just continue this indefinitely to where it's like, part 150, and we're still responding to these guys just because someone has to do it. Al-Din, just so you know, because we're apparently we have to educate you not just about Christianity, but about Islam, since you're denying basic Islamic theology. But we also want to give you the tools to think properly and critically about these things so that when one of your speakers is deceiving you, you can spot it, right? And one of the things you're going to learn, we're going to teach you, lesson number one right now, lesson number one. What you just did is called a straw man. It's called the straw man fallacy. That is where you are, instead of actually refuting what your opponent said, you make something up about what he said and then attack your own misrepresentation of it, right? You attack him based on something he didn't actually say, right? Which is what you just did, which is what Mohammed Hijab did over and over and over again. So there is this running problem in Islam that we can say, here's our argument, and then you'll say, okay, my opponents say, and you'll give some completely fake argument that no one used. And then you'll attack that and you'll laugh at it, and the entire Muslim crowd over here or in an audience or wherever will join with you in laughing at it when all you've done is deceive people. But let's go ahead and, matter of fact, let's go through these few clips, these last few clips from Mohammed Asim, because we want to get to some other Muslim scholars. Let's go through these last few clips of Mohammed Asim, sort of rapid fire. I'll play a clip. They're all short. They're all like 20 to 40 seconds long. I'll play them. Let Anthony comment briefly. And then once we've played through the four, then we'll sort of summarize. So let's go ahead and jump to the next one by Sheikh Asim al-Hakim, who is a heretic, apparently, according to our good friend Al-Din.
Allah says in Surah Al-Qalam that on the day of judgment, Allah Azza wa Jal would uplift and show His leg. وَيُكْشَفُ عَنْ سَاقٍ وَيُدْعَوْنَ إِلَى السُّجُودِ. And they are called to prostrate, and everyone prostrates except the hypocrites. All the believers will prostrate, and the hypocrites will try to prostrate, and their back goes one piece, and they will be thrown into hell.
So, does Allah has a shin, Anthony? Is that correct? We've been through this multiple times, but
yeah, there he basically spliced together two things. One statement in the Quran, Surah 68:42, that makes reference to the laying bare of the shin, which in the Hadith is further explained by Muhammad as referring to what takes place on the Day of Judgment, namely when Allah appears to certain Muslims and they don't at first recognize him. He's ultimately going to disclose himself and make it clear that he's the true Allah, the one that they've always worshipped in this world, by showing them his shin. And supposedly, they already have an idea of what that shin looks like, because when they see it, they're going to say, you are our Lord. And in fact, one hadith even says it's going to, the picture or image or form, of Allah that they will see is going to correspond to the mental image they already had in their mind. So there's some way that this knowledge has come to them, telling them what Allah has looked like in order that they might identify him on that day. And so that's what Sheikh Asim is referring to there, is the Quranic statement, Surah 68:42, and the multiple hadiths that make reference to the Day of Judgment, the appearance of Allah, him coming to them in his true form, and then ultimately exposing his shin.
In other words, exactly what you've been saying over and over again as we've gone through this series. And Muslims keep telling us, no, it's not a real shin, it's not a real shin, it's not a real shin. Sheikh Asim here is affirming, no, Allah has a shin because that's what the Muslim sources tell us. All right, let's go ahead and jump to the next one. This one is also short.
Allah tells us about himself subhanahu wa ta'ala that he has an eye. The Prophet tells us that Allah Azza wa Jal has fingers. When he says, "Oh Allah, the hearts are between two of your fingers, you flip them as you wish. Oh Allah, make my heart steadfast on your religion," and so on.
So Allah has an eye, Allah has fingers. He's not making this up, right, Anthony? This is according to the sources which you've gone through already.
Right. Numerous statements in the Quran say Allah has eyes. Noah was told to construct the ark under Allah's eyes. Surah 11:37, 20:36, numerous other ayahs of the Quran. The hadith as well make reference to Allah's eyes. He already gave a hadith reference that spoke of Allah's fingers. The heart is between the two fingers of Allah. There are others that I think are more obviously literal, such as the statements that Allah put his hand and palm and even fingers on Muhammad's back, and Muhammad felt its coolness in his chest. Other statements of that sort. So again, this is just going right back to the Islamic sources. It's dealing honestly with them. It's taking them at face value. And it's not trying to explain away those statements that go beyond just the appearance of saying he has these things, and actually describe them and associate certain actions with them that can only be properly understood or explained in terms of literal hands. Mm-hmm. So,
all right, let's look at one more from Dr. Asim. Sheikh Asim, and now he's going to give the correct Islamic understanding. He's going to point out, so he's going to grant, yes, Allah really has these parts, but don't make a mistake. And guess what? It's the same thing we keep saying, that is the mistake you are to avoid according to what Muslim scholars say. So let's go ahead and watch him.
When I say that an elephant has a leg, and I have a leg, and an ant has a leg, are the legs similar? Definitely not. And Allah Azza wa Jal has the highest example. We do not Azza wa Jal simulate him to any of his creatures. But you believe that Allah is alive. So why don't you say that living is also part of human nature? Allah Azza wa Jal subhanahu wa ta'ala is alive. Allah Azza wa Jal is all hearing, all seeing. So Allah sees and Allah hears, and I hear and I see. But there is no resemblance, none whatsoever, except in the description. Therefore, you have to believe in the things that Allah described himself, in the things that the Prophet described his Lord Azza wa Jal, and take it as it is without any addition.
All right, now Anthony, it seems that everything he was just saying are things that you and I have said over and over again, and things that Muslims in the chat keep denying and saying we're lying for saying. And now we're showing that their own Muslim scholars have said these things. So his first point was about, the leg of an elephant or the leg of an ant or the leg of a human being. These are all very different kind of legs. So since you're saying that Allah has a leg, don't assume that it's the same kind of leg that you're thinking of in your mind. And so how often have we said that?
Yeah. So it's a leg, but it may not be grayish like an elephant's leg, or fat and stumpy like some other creature. We're not necessarily told all the details of it, but it's still a leg. You notice he said that it's not similar to other things except in the description, meaning that there at least has to be a sufficient amount of similarity or correspondence between, the leg in the case of Allah and the leg in the case of other things in order to refer to both of them as legs. But since Allah is not identical to man in every way, there also has to be some differences. And we may not know all the details that enter into the picture there. But the fact is there's enough correspondence to identify it as a leg or a hand or a face and so forth. And to distinguish these parts from one another, right? His hand is not his foot is not his hand. So that's no different than what we've been saying.
Mm-hmm. And he pointed out, right, he's correcting Muslims who try to misinterpret this, and they say, well, but if you say Allah has a leg of any kind or face of any kind, if you say Allah has these parts, then you're saying he has things that other beings have, and you can't do that. And then he responds by saying, wait a minute, human beings are living. We say that Allah is living. Do you believe that Allah is living? So you believe he has that feature. Allah is not living in the same way that human beings. The way Allah lives is very different, but we can still say that he is really living, and we say of human beings that they are really living. So we are affirming these statements are literally true, even though they're true in very different ways. And so that's his comparison for the claims that we're making. So yes, Allah has literal legs. He has literal parts. He has these things literally. We don't understand what they're like. We don't know because he hasn't told us, but they have to be literal. And so that about sums it up, right?
Yeah.
All right. And so going back to Aladdin here, you mentioned, just because we want to make sure that he understands this, the comment you brought up where he's talking, show me where he has a human part. So he says, David, you said Allah has part as human. I challenge you to show me any Islamic sources say Allah has part like human, as you claim. Please, otherwise you lie. Thanks. Please bring me live, easy to refute your arguments. So notice, we weren't saying that Allah has parts like the human. Now, as we have pointed out in some of the other live streams, you could make that case, right, Anthony? You could make the case that some of his parts are like the human parts, right? Because notice he said any Muslim source, right? Let me see what he actually said. I challenge you to show me in any Islamic sources say that Allah has parts like a human. Now, just to be clear, Aladdin, because you like to misrepresent what we say, just so everyone can hear exactly what we're saying. We're saying that the Orthodox Islamic understanding, right, that's what we've been focusing on. The Orthodox understanding is that Allah has a literal eye, literal hands. These things are literal. He has a literal face. He has these things. But the Muslim scholars will say, don't think that you can imagine them, and don't think that it's like you. Don't think that it's like you. You affirm that he has literal parts, but not those that are like you. Because just as you can have a different leg from the way an ant has a leg, so Allah can have a leg different from the way you have a leg. So we've affirmed that as the Orthodox Islamic position. But Anthony, if he's just saying any Islamic source, do we have reason to think that some of Allah's parts are actually like human parts?
Yeah, there's several things here. One thing is that when Muhammad mentions these attributes of Allah, they're often in a context where it assumes that Muhammad knows what to call these things precisely because he has some analogy. What he's seeing is analogous to what he knows by experience, right? For example, we have hadiths where Muhammad says, I saw my Lord, the most exalted and glorious, in the most beautiful form, right? So Muhammad is here taking a term that he knows from human experience and he's applying it to Allah. He's saying, this is the right term to use for what I saw, right? And then we also have, for example, I mentioned Ahmed bin Hanbal, a major source of hadiths. He was a significant hadith scholar and one of the founders of Islam's 4 primary madhabs or schools of fiqh. He reports hadiths where Muhammad describes Allah sitting on his throne with a red robe, and he even describes Allah's beard and things like that. All of these descriptions assume, because again, this is Muhammad describing Allah, right? These are the words that Muhammad chooses to describe what he saw. And he's talking about a literal, visible appearance. And so all of that just seems obviously to suggest something akin to a human being. Plus, when you read the unquestionable hadiths in Bukhari and Muslim, and you have Allah's hand being further defined as having a palm, having fingers, you even have reference to his fingertips and so forth. All of this is painting a picture that makes it very difficult to say that it's something radically different from a human hand. You know, it seems to point to a lot of similarities between the two. But furthermore, there's a problem in saying one of the things that Muslims always want to do is appeal to passages like Surah 42:11, which says there's nothing like Allah, or Surah 112:4, which says there's nothing comparable to Him, and say that these are ruling out saying that Allah has body parts or saying that His parts are in any significant way like human beings. Contextually, those passages aren't talking about that. Contextually, those passages are saying Allah doesn't have a spouse or mate, and therefore He doesn't have a son. He doesn't beget and isn't begotten. It's not saying that He doesn't have the equipment. He simply doesn't have the necessary mate with whom to carry out those activities that would produce a son. So those passages are really irrelevant. But furthermore, I mean, you have the fact that when Muslims see Allah on the Day of Judgment, they're going to have a mental picture of Allah in order to recognize Him. And notice how significant this is. You can't just brush this off, right? If they get there on that day and don't recognize who their Lord is, then they're going to be cast off with the rest of the unbelievers, the non-Muslims. They're going to be led astray. Is the whole point of those hadiths is talking about people who are led astray following false gods and so forth. If a Muslim doesn't have the mental picture of Allah by which to recognize Allah on that day, then he's going to be lost. And so that assumes that the picture that Muhammad is painting is something that we can understand sufficiently well enough in order to have this mental construct, right? I mean, and so if you're going to say that these things describe something so totally different and foreign to us, then nobody's going to recognize Allah on that day, not even the most faithful or devout Muslim. Certainly not Al-Din.
And so, just so we can understand what level of confidence Al-Din has in his God and his prophet, Allah says that He's going to reveal the Shin in the Quran, and in the Hadith, we have the details on how that works. Allah is going to lift up His garment, and you, as a Muslim, are going to recognize Allah by His Shin. You will recognize your God by His Shin. So, Al-Din, tell us, one, does Allah have a Shin? Does He have a literal Shin, or are your Muslim sources and your Muslim scholars wrong? Right? So does Allah have a literal Shin? Two, tell us what it looks like. If you can't tell us what it looks like, then Muhammad didn't know what he's talking about, or you're not a real Muslim. Because Muhammad says that Muslims are the ones who actually submit to Allah. They know what it looks like. So tell us what Allah's Shin looks like, how you're going to recognize Him by it, or you're basically telling us that your prophet's a false prophet, or you're just not a true Muslim. Take your pick. I want to see that in the comments section. Wanted to address a quick comment right here because it's a short one, and I spotted it real quick. Josh says, I have a question. David, where the verse where Allah prays for the prophet? Well, you have a couple passages in the Quran which talk about Allah praying. The one that I brought up in the video was Surah 33, verse 56. You could also look at Surah 33, verse 43. And Surah 2, verse 157. So 2, 157, 33, 43, and 33, 56. These are passages that talk about Allah praying, or Allah's prayers being upon Muhammad or someone else. So, and just so you know, when you look these up, they're not going to say Allah prays. It's going to say something like Allah sends blessings on people or something like that. That's how Muslim scholars have convinced people to translate these passages, because they want to avoid the obvious implication that Allah is praying. But there's far more here than that. So you can go back and watch my video on Allah praying and check that out. And by the way, when I did that, there's way more. There's way more, because you have a ton of interesting stuff from the hadiths as well that actually rule out the Muslim responses. And if you go back to the earlier Muslims, they wanted to deny that Allah is praying. They wanted to say we have to translate this in some other way, but they kept translating it in completely different ways. And why were they translating it in completely different ways? Well, because the word means pray, and they're trying to translate it as all these other things. And so they're going to have a problem in the future. But yeah, go ahead and look up those passages, look up the verses. Go to look up Sam Shamoun's articles on this, right? So just type into Google Sam Shamoun, Allah prays, and one of Sam's articles should pop up to go through not just what the Quran says, but what some of the other Muslim sources say. Go ahead, Ant. Hey, your sound is off.
Yeah, let me quickly say that one of the easiest ways to do this is to go to Answering Islam, scroll down the left side column and look for the Search the Site tab, and then search it that way. That'll take you to numerous articles by Sam.
Yep, and so what do we got left? Gosh, we only got 15 minutes left. You want to go through a couple more of these video clips here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Oh, wait a minute. Got another awesome super chat here. Ellie Shamoun says, Jesus loves you. Thank you, Ellie. I agree. And Jesus loves you too. All right, now let's go ahead and watch a few more clips. This is by another Muslim scholar who's going to affirm basically the same thing. And so this is Dr. Mohammed Salah. He's going to be discussing Allah's parts. And I like the way he sits, just so you know, at the very beginning, this first clip, he's reading a question. And the question is from someone like Aladdin, who thinks that Allah can't have literal body parts. And so he asks his question about how could people think that Allah has body parts? And watch Mohammed Salah's response here at the beginning.
Some Muslims believe that Allah has an arm or a leg as stated in the Quran. How can this be correct? Isn't it? This is attributing human qualities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, subhanallah, Brother Tahir, you just answered yourself in the beginning when you said some Muslims believe that Allah has an arm or leg as it is stated and mentioned in the Quran. So if it is stated in the Quran, what other proof do you need?
Now, I love that one, Anthony, right? So the guy says, hey, some Muslims are saying that some Muslim scholars are saying that Allah has body parts as it's stated in the Quran. Why would they think that? Why could they think something like this? And the Muslim scholar says, he responds, you just answered the question. It's written in the Quran. What other proof do you need?
Yeah, I'm gonna write to him and say, Aladdin says Allah doesn't have these attributes, even though they're mentioned in the Quran. What would you say? What should I tell him?
Yeah, and then when he gives us a response, we can go ahead and play it here.
Yeah.
And, all right, so that's how he goes ahead and sets up the issue. That's how he sets up the issue. That hey, it's saying it in the Quran. That's where we get the claim that Allah has these parts. But let him go through some of the same things. We've been over this over and over again, but we just need to. I mean, at the beginning, we were thinking 1 or 2 live streams on this issue, but the same things keep coming up, and Muslims keep coming in the comment section and saying, "No, I don't. No, you're wrong. You're lying. You're making this up." No matter how many sources we quote, that we might have to do one more, just because we are not going to get through nearly all of the clips. So we'll probably have one more, and then we really don't want to just keep doing this indefinitely. Week to week, but we will certainly have to revisit it periodically. And as I pointed out, I'll probably end up doing like a Man God Monday series throughout 2019, just so everyone has nice short videos with all of these topics in it. And just so you know, Anthony, you had like 4 or 5 parts of a series called Allah the Man God, right?
Yeah, but it's still worth doing again. Those were some of my earlier videos, but the content is still there. In fact, you'll find in most of my videos, one of the things that I try to do, and I'm usually pretty consistent about, and it's why some of the videos take some time, it's because I'm trying to find clips from Muslim scholars, because I know that inevitably I'm going to get an Aladdin who's going to say, this isn't true, you're lying, you're making it up, you're misinterpreting. And so it's always good to have at least some Muslims in there to show that this is what the scholars are saying, even if this message hasn't gotten out to the mass of Muslims, right, the Aladdins of the Ummah. So if you go to those videos, I'll reference the sources in the Quran, in the Hadith, and then I'll play 1, 2, or 3 Islamic scholars saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And super chat from Kyokushin Karate, Texas. I took Shotokan when I was a teenager. I did plenty of that. Now my kids do MMA, so Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. My son Blaze just switched to wrestling as his grappling because he wanted to be on the school's wrestling team. So I don't know how he's going to, because very, very different. People think, oh, it's all grappling. But we're going to see how he adapts to wrestling, which has very different rules, right? The Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys, they love being on their back. If you go to your back in wrestling, you've lost. You've doomed yourself. So we'll see how he adapts. But,
earlier, I was watching Caro Parisian. Did you ever watch him when he was fighting in the UFC?
Nope.
He was the guy. He's an Armenian guy, but he was really good at judo. And one of the things that was unique about him is that he was effective with judo, even without the gi. And that's usually, a problem a lot of judo people have is they can't effectively use it or as effectively use it. Anyways, I always enjoyed watching his fights because he pulled off these incredible moves. Even though he wasn't the best, he actually had a good record, but he wasn't the best. But whenever he was able to pull off one of these judo throws, it was awesome.
Well,
anyway.
Is everyone here, Anthony, promoting this sort of violent combat sport? I can't believe this. All right, let's go ahead and go through, what do we got? We got 9 minutes. Let's try and get through these last couple of clips here. So this is Dr. Muhammad Salah, and I think in this video is going to start talking about Allah's parts.
Number one, Allah subhanahu, He mentioned specific parts, and I would mention them and the references in the Quran. A part of the ayah in this segment, He says, بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ Allah's hands are stretched out. Doesn't only have one hand, rather two. يَدَاهُ dual. His two hands are stretched out. The saq here refers to Allah's shin. So He has a leg, and He would lay down, uncovered or bare His shin so that people will fall in prostration, except those who fail to prostrate in this life, they will not.
Now, I don't know if you noticed, Anthony, but he was saying the exact same thing we've been saying. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I can't help but notice it looks like he's wearing one of those Santa hats on his head. You notice it's a little red on top over there, and
yeah, I'm wondering what area that is from, because they wear different headgear depending on what area they're from.
Yeah. I'm sure he's not wearing one of those, but same thing that we're saying. And one thing to remember is that when Muslims refer to certain parts, there's a whole science of interpretation behind a lot of this that a lot of people don't know. And again, I'll use Allah ad-Din here as an example.
Wait. Let me go ahead and add his comment. Read his comment, and then, because basically you're refuting his comment right now. So Allah ad-Din said, David, what you are doing is imposing your wrong interpretation of Quran on Muslims, like you did with Jewish Tanakh. Weakness can't prove your faith without corrupting Tanakh. Notice, we're playing clips by Muslim scholars who are saying exactly the same things that we're saying, and he's saying we're corrupting it. So notice, according to this, Anthony, we have corrupted his Muslim scholars. So his Muslim scholars got this information from us. They got this false view of Allah from us, and now they're going around spreading it around the world. And not only that, Anthony, we must have built a time machine, because Muslims have been saying these things for nearly 14 centuries. So what we are saying now about Allah's parts, Muslims have been saying for 14 centuries, and you're saying we're the ones who corrupted them. So, Anthony, you must have a time machine in your garage.
Yeah, I'm actually quite grateful that he's attributed as much power and authority to us as he has. I'm going to try and figure out some other ways to use it that are profitable. But yeah, so I mean, remember, Muslims always say to us, when we make a comment, what do they often say? They'll say, you don't know Arabic. Okay. Then we get an Arabic scholar and they've got another excuse. Well, this is why most Muslims are beholden to their sheikhs and imams, right? Because these are the ones who have not only, learned the language or already knew the language, but have made, sufficient, advances in the study of the different sources, if it comes to the Quran or if it comes to the Hadith, whatever it is, they have made those strides forward in those disciplines and are now qualified to speak to them. And this is, it's why it's a discouragement to many Muslims to read some of their sources, because they think, well, we're not really adequate to the task, right? We can't really say what the Quran means here without an authoritative interpretation. Same thing with the Hadith. We always have to wonder, is this a sound Hadith? Or, there's just all these reasons why the average Muslim has to lack confidence in making pronouncements, unless he's talking to Christians and pretending like he knows more than he does. But notice, we get an Islamic scholar on here now who does have the authority, he does have the credentials, he does have the background that makes him an authority in Islam, at least to speak with knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And here we have a Muslim saying we can't even trust him. So one of the things, everybody should be asking themselves is it even possible for anybody to really know what Islam says or teaches when you have all these qualifications? It reminds me of Anthony Fleur's famous, I don't think it works, the one that he gave, right? The missing gardener.
Yeah.
You know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, the parable of the gardener.
Yeah, you have Islam dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. Yeah. Right? Whenever you want to try and critique it, they give you one more reason why you don't know what you're talking about and you can't understand it, which means at the end of the day, nobody can really say they know what Islam is, unless, of course, this is all just made up in order to get Islam out of 101 problems, which, of course, is what we're
So the conclusion to draw from Muslims telling us all the different ways where we can't understand what Allah is saying. So notice, just to repeat what Anthony is saying, right? We sit there and read the words and you say, oh, okay, well, you're not a scholar. So we quote Muslim scholars and then you say, oh, you're still wrong. You're still getting us all wrong, even though we're playing videos, right? We go to Muslim scholars down through the centuries. We go to the Quran. We go to the Hadith. We go to the Sirah. We go to the Tafsir. Everything is agreeing with us. We go to Muslim scholars down through the centuries. They're all agreeing with us. We show you videos of Muslim scholars today saying exactly what we say, and you're saying, no, you can't understand any of it. You still don't understand. Well, the conclusion to draw from all that is that Islam just can't be understood. It's completely useless, waste of time, can't be the true religion if it can't be understood. So, if you want to say that Islam is the religion for the entire world, you better find a different religion besides Islam, because what you're telling us about Islam is just doesn't fit.
And another thing we could ask is, okay, so Allah claims to be clear in the Quran. But apparently we're misreading his clear words, so they're not very clear to us. Same thing, ditto in the case of the Hadith and Muslim scholars throughout history and the ones whose clips we're playing now. All of those people are either not clear or are obviously wrong, but who is Al-Din in comparison to any of this to speak authoritatively to what the Islamic position is? In
other words, you've got this guy in the comments section. And the reason we're interacting is because, he keeps coming back. And so that is a plus, right? If you keep coming back and you keep getting refuted and you keep coming back, then I'm happy to keep responding to you, because I start thinking, well, maybe you're being drawn, right? Maybe you're being drawn by God. And that's the reason you keep coming back. We're interacting, but seriously, we're showing from the Quran, we're showing from the Hadith, we're showing from the Muslim sources, we're showing from Muslim scholars down through history, and now we're playing clips from them. And Al-Din's response is basically, no, don't believe any of that, just believe me. And that is absolutely amazing. What you're telling us is that we shouldn't submit to Allah and Muhammad. You're telling us Allah and Muhammad are they don't know what they're talking about. And we shouldn't listen to what Muslim scholars say about your sources and about your theology. We need to reject them, throw everything out, and we just need to believe what you're saying over here in the comments section. That is very interesting methodology here. But it looks like we're going to go a few minutes over. We try to stick to an hour. Doesn't always work. And here's a situation where we're going to have to go a couple of minutes over because we wanted to get to these last two clips. I don't want to play the first two clips and not let the doctor finish what he's saying. Did want to give a shout out to Zim Khan and Evangeline and Ernie, the child of Jesus, who are all jumping in on the super chat. Thank you, everyone. There are a couple questions around here. We'll try and get to them if we can, but we want to get through these last couple of clips real quick. Let me get this comment of Al-Din off here. And here we go. So this is Dr. Mohammed Salah, clip 3.
So every ayah speaks about Allah's sight, Allah's hearing, Allah's attributes. You gotta measure it according to the other ayah of Surah Ash-Shura, which will say that every Muslim, every ordinary Muslim must be aware of this ayah. In ayah number 11 of Surah Ash-Shura, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Negation. There is nothing that exists which is like Him. And Allah does have eyes, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described Himself. وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَى عَيْنِي. But we can say that our eyes are like His. There is no comparisons.
So, Anthony, once again, as far as I can tell, that's what we've been saying from day one on this issue. He's saying, yes, Allah has eyes. He says Allah has these parts, but we know that Allah is not like us, and so we don't really understand what they're like. Now, you've offered you've responded to that. We have to have some notion of what these things are like, or the hadiths about Allah bearing His shin don't make any sense. We have to, if we take some of the other passages about Allah being, having a solid body, or creating Adam in His own image, His own physical image, there are some challenges to that, and the correct understanding of the passages in the Quran that say that there's nothing like Allah. But when we're talking about what Orthodox Islam teaches, we have been clear, saying it over and over and over again, exactly what these Muslim scholars are saying.
Yeah, and in one sense, it makes no difference to us in terms of the problem we're undermining here. Whether you say that Allah's hands and feet are like ours or not like ours, right? At the end of the day, the thing that we're doing is we're responding, number one, to Muslims who claim this is not true. Number two, we're responding to those who pretend there's a problem when it comes to the incarnation, right? Even though the incarnation refers to not to God as He is in Himself, but to the Son when He took upon Himself a human nature, which isn't to be confused with His divine nature. It doesn't make any difference either way. The Islamic argument is undermined, and the Muslim misconception of their God is cleared up. And it shows that even with respect to the nature and attributes of their deity, it's not the same God as the God of the Bible. Mm-hmm. It's not the God that Old Covenant Jews worshiped. It's not the God that Christians worship. If Muslims want to say that their God is the same as the Jews believe in, for example, well, they're going to have to be talking about a group of Jews that are apostate and don't believe the Torah, but are following other things like the Talmud, which is, by the way, the same kind of Jews that were around Muhammad at the time he was formulating his notion of God. Mm-hmm. We haven't brought this up before, but there are certain hadiths that some Muslims will reject simply because they come from Jewish converts to Islam. Mm-hmm. And there's such an opposition to Jews that even though they became Muslims and were handing on traditions from Muhammad, these are rejected because just because they came from Jews. But the interesting thing is a lot of those hadiths make reference to the literal attributes, literal body parts of Allah. Right? We're talking here about medieval Jews, right? Jews at the time of Muhammad, post-Christian, apostate, Talmudic Jews. And so it's interesting. You have not only these clear statements in the Islamic sources, but even the very context within which Muhammad was formulating his conception of deity. It was rife with just this sort of understanding, mm-hmm. right? Pagans believed this. The Jewish tribes there believed this, but these are all later Jews. These aren't. Mm-hmm. In fact, these are Jews that were very likely also influenced very much by their pagan counterparts in the Sinai Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I just don't understand. It seems like the appropriate Muslim response would be, "Wow, guys, I didn't know this before. My imam didn't tell me this. My parents didn't tell me this. But you're showing it from my God and my prophets, and and Muslim scholars. So thank you for being the one to actually tell me what Islam teaches. But that's just not the response. You guys are still lying somehow.
By the way, so I should mention this. So I actually had a conversation with Aladdin the other day when I was on with Vocab. You mentioned that you talked to him on Vocab show as well. And apparently he found his way over to my YouTube page, which I don't often update now since I mostly put up stuff on this page. But every time I make a comment, I don't know why it is, but he'll go over to one of my videos over there and start having a conversation with me about whatever has nothing to do with that video.
Yeah.
So he left a comment right now on one of my videos that popped up, and he says, "Unfortunately, all you do with David in your live stream is giving false claim without giving the evidence. So I answered you in here."
All we do is give evidence. He's not giving any evidence. And guys, do you notice this? Because again, this is what Muslim apologists do, and now this is what their followers do in response. They misrepresent everything we said, and they just keep saying, oh, they haven't given us any evidence, and we're the ones giving the evidence, even though they're giving no evidence, and we've been giving evidence all along. So very interesting situation there. Let me go to this comment from Evangeline here, and then we'll play the last clip and go ahead and wrap up. But Evangeline says, did you know, Muslims? Allah is a Muslim himself. He said his shahada in Surah 3, verse 18, Allah bears witness that there is no deity except him, and so do the angels and those of knowledge. And just as a little side note, notice Allah is doing the same thing that his creatures do in this situation. For those of you who are saying Allah has to be completely different, he's doing the same thing. So notice when we say Allah prays, because that's what the Quran says, and it's Allah. Notice the parallel here, right, that you have in Surah 33, verse 56 of the Quran. There, it's Allah and his angels pray, so you believers pray on the Prophet as well, or pray for the Prophet as well. Here, it's Allah witnesses that there is no deity except him, and so do the angels and those of knowledge. So notice the parallel. It's Allah is doing what you guys are doing. So Allah prays just like the angels and you guys pray. Allah bears witness. Allah recites the Shahada just like you guys and the angels recite the Shahada. And little side note there, also in Surah 1, Surah Al-Fatiha is a perfect example of this, right? Because the Quran is supposed to be Allah speaking to human beings. And so various passages in the Quran, it will say, right? It will say, if it's something that human beings are supposed to say, it will say, right? So that's how you know even those passages where it's human beings talking, it's Allah telling them what to say. But if you look at Surah Al-Fatiha, there is no say. It's just a prayer. Now, why is this relevant? Well, this is a prayer, but the entire Quran is supposedly the speech of Allah. And so Surah Al-Fatiha is a prayer, and yet before there were humans to recite it, the Quran is supposedly the eternal speech of Allah. So from all eternity, Allah was reciting a prayer. Interesting theology we have here. All right, let's go ahead and play this last video clip, and then Anthony, you can sum things up for us. So this is the fourth clip from Dr. Mohammed Salah, and here he's going to tell us how to tell us, what the response should be. Yes, we have all of these claims about Allah having body parts. What do we do with that?
The belief of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah in the light of the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and our predecessors, as-Sahaba and as-Salaf as-Salih, is that we affirm to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala what He affirmed for Himself. He said that He has hands. Oh, He has hands. Without alteration, without interpretation, without changing, without giving our personal opinion, because He has hands. So we take whatever Allah described Himself with as facts. I told you before, your mind is very limited and your understanding is very narrow.
Well, there you have it, Anthony. the position of Muslims, the position of Orthodox Islamic theology is that whatever Allah has affirmed for himself, we affirm. And if we don't get it, great. Our understanding is limited. That sound about right?
Yeah. And he said that it's not to be explained away, reinterpreted. It's to be taken as it's stated. Allah is to be understood as speaking at face value in the Quran. He's in fact, I mean, as soon as somebody wants to start trying to tinker with the words and reinterpret them and all of that, they're essentially undermining the Quran's main claim for its own divine origin and inspiration. Yep. Right? The boast of the Quran over and over again is that it's eloquent. Its eloquence is unsurpassed and insurpassable by any creature, man or jinn, or any combination or collection of creatures. And Allah is so clear and so detailed. His word is self-evidently divine in origin. It's obviously from him. It can't be imitated. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as soon as Muslims start, chipping away at that by playing games and saying this doesn't mean that and it can mean something else, no matter how clear it otherwise appears, they're attacking and undermining one of the qualities and characteristics of the Quran, and thus undermining its major argument for itself. But in summary, we've seen, in contrast to Al-Adin, that the Quran, this isn't the video where we've been laying out the major case from the Quran and the Hadith. Here we've been mostly focusing on what Muslim scholars in the present are saying, but in previous videos we have emphasized all of the Quranic or a lot of the Quranic passages, numerous hadiths, and even some of the earliest Muslims. But having said that, we did give numerous passages. Quickly I mentioned passages referring to Allah's face, like Surah 2:115, or Allah's eyes, like Surah 11:37, or Allah's side, Surah 39:56, Allah's shins, Surah 68:42. Allah's hands, Surah 38:75. I mean, there's no shortage of passages that we could appeal to. So we've shown that the Quran affirms these things for Allah. The Hadiths make mention of these things, and Islamic scholars have made mention of these things. Now, the fact that there are certain Muslims today who don't believe that or are ignorant of it doesn't change the fact that it's very clear in the Islamic sources. It was the position of the earliest Muslims. In fact, some early Muslims would even go further than we're going, right? I mean, I could easily quote Muslims. In fact, I will. Here's a quote that I'm not even saying the Islamic sources go this far, but this was an early Muslim nonetheless. His name was Dawood al-Jawaribi. He said his deity is a body in the form of a human with flesh and blood, and said his upper half is hollow and lower half is solid. He said that his deity has curly hair. However, he claimed that it's a body unlike the bodies, and flesh unlike the fleshes, and blood unlike the bloods. He said, "Pardon me," this is a quote from him, I love this quote, "pardon me for the beard and private parts, but you can ask me about anything else." In other words, he's saying, Allah has all these attributes, and I'm willing to talk about all of them, just don't ask me to talk about his gonads, right? So, I mean, but we haven't even been we haven't gone to that length, right? We've simply said that Allah has parts. It includes eyes and face and hands and feet and shin and so forth. Everything that can be found in the Quran itself, in the uncontested hadith, the sound Sahih narrations in Bukhari and Muslim, and this is what Islamic scholars have been saying.
Mm-hmm. All right, and just as one little last vindication here is Umar Mujahid saying, yes, Allah has hands, but not like human.
Well, so thank you, Mujahid.
we're fine with that. So again, Anthony would point to certain passages in the Muslim sources which would point out that we know some things about Allah's hands, but you're saying exactly what we've been saying. So thank you for vindicating us in our entire series here.
Now let me just point out one thing here, so that to give Mujahid here something to think about. Muslims say that Allah is one, right? And they object to the doctrine of the Trinity because it says something about God that goes beyond saying that he's only one, right? We believe that God is one. Mm-hmm. He's one in his essential nature, his being, but he's three in person. He's tripersonal. There are three persons who share the one essence or being of God. But Muslims don't like that. They want to say that Allah is only one and he's one in every sense. He's one absolutely. Well, as soon as you start admitting that Allah has body and parts, or form and parts, hands, feet, and so forth, now you've introduced a kind of plurality into the definition of your deity. So here's my question. The Quran, the Islamic sources say that Muslims are going to see Allah on the day of resurrection. My question is this: are you going to see all of Allah or only part of him? Okay, if you say you're going to see all of Allah, then that either assumes that Allah is finite, such that you can see him, or it assumes that you're infinite. Now, either one of those are problematic. If Allah is finite, then he's not truly God. Mm-hmm. But if you're infinite enough to view all of Allah, then that is shirk, right? It's associating you with Allah in his attributes. Now, if you say you're only going to see part of Allah, then you're admitting your God is made up of parts. If he's made up of parts, then he's not absolutely one. If he's not absolutely one, then once again, Islam is a religion of shirk by its own definition.
Mm-hmm. So
that's the problem to me.
Yeah. So notice what we've been doing all along is just telling you what Islam actually teaches about these issues, what Orthodox Islam actually teaches. And now that even Muslims are agreeing with us because it's just clear from their sources, now you're going to have to start dealing with the implications, which is what Anthony just did. Since there is some denial about Allah's parts still from someone like Aladdin, we will have one more live stream in this series. That will be next Friday. Next Friday work, Anthony?
Yeah.
All right. Next week, Anthony, we will go through some more clips from some more scholars just to give you more evidence that this is Orthodox Islam. And hopefully all the Muslims in the chat will then be agreeing that what we are saying is absolutely correct. Allah has literal body parts, and therefore Muslims who start complaining about the incarnation have a problem because their God always has literal body parts. For those who are up in the middle of the night, late tomorrow night, I'll be up all night long, and Vocab and I will be live streaming again starting at about 2 o'clock in the morning Eastern Standard Time. So that's technically Sunday, early Sunday morning, technically. But then Sunday night, I'll be live with Sam Shamoon, and we'll be talking about the incarnation and the deity of Christ. So for those Muslims who are troubled by this issue, this is normally one of the top 2 or 3 issues that trouble them most. We're going to be talking about that, so show up with your questions. We will be happy to interact with them. So thanks, everyone, for joining in. Thanks, everyone, for jumping in on the Super Chat, and look forward to talking to you next time. God bless everyone.